The New Mutants was the long-awaited entry in the popular X-Men film franchise. And by long-awaited, I mean that we had to wait a long time for this film to come out. This film was plagued by numerous production problems. It was originally supposed to be released back in, I think, 2018. So we had to wait years for this film to finally come out. And by that time, people had already forgotten about it. They had moved on to other comic book franchises like the DC Cinematic Universe, and of course, Marvel keeps putting out content on a year-by-year basis. So by the time the New Mutants finally came out back in 2020, I think folks had just grown tired of the X-Men franchise overall, and honestly, this is a series that probably should have ended with 2017's Logan. So, needless to say, the New Mutants wasn't necessarily worth the wait, and I'm going to get into the many reasons why this film can be considered a failed experiment.
No, sir, I didn't like it.
Now, just up front, I'm not overly familiar with the X-Men comic book series. I haven't touched a single X-Men comic in my life. I have watched all the X-Men films, dating back to the 1999 Bryan Singer release, and I have enjoyed most of them. It's kind of a hit and miss franchise. Some films were obviously better than others. For every Logan, you had an X-Men Apocalypse. But the New Mutants was meant to be something different. The director Josh Boone said that he wanted to incorporate more horror elements into this movie. So it was going to combine your traditional Marvel comic book movie with that of a horror movie. And for that reason alone, I was actually kind of curious about the New Mutants. Just the fact that this was supposed to be an all-out horror film set in the Marvel Universe, that definitely got me kind of excited. And for years, I had been building this film up. I was talking about how excited I was. I was intrigued by the first trailer. I thought that it looked different than all the comic book movies that we had been getting in recent years. So yeah, when I first read the description for this movie, I thought it sounded very similar to another popular horror film, that being A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. The fact that you have all these young teens, at this mental institute where, they're being examined by doctors, or in this case, just one doctor. A little bit strange that Alice Braga is the only doctor in this movie. Apparently, this production didn't have a high enough budget to cast, other hospital employees, which I thought was a little bit strange. But anyway, this film is no Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors. Nightmare on Elm Street 3, for one, the teen characters in that movie were, very likable. That movie had a kinetic energy, and it had a very menacing villain in the form of Freddy Krueger, one of the most famous horror villains of all time. The New Mutants is a mostly dreary affair with characters who really got on my nerves at first. I grew to like some of them a bit more by the end of the film, but you have tremendously talented young actors like Anya Taylor-Joy from The Witch, you have Charlie Heaton from Stranger Things, you have Maisie Williams, Arya Stark from Game of Thrones, all coming together, and just to see them deliver performances that can be best described as subpar, it was kind of heartbreaking.
Are you crazy? That thing will kill you!
He's right, it's magic!
And the fact that this was going to be a much more subdued, low-budget comic book movie actually got me excited because I was ready for something different. We had been bombarded by all of these action-packed, big-budget films like Endgame and Infinity War, which were very good, on their own terms, but I was ready for something that was, much more psychological, something that was actually going to, explore these characters, explore what makes them tick, explore their fears and their weaknesses. So I was ready for this movie. And the problem with this movie is that it is inhabited by characters who just honestly don't work, and there's many reasons why they don't work. The first 30 minutes of this movie are so utterly dreary. The plot involves a young Native American girl played by Blue Hunt, a very talented young actress, I might add, who is transferred to this hospital to be examined by Alice Braga, and she quickly meets up with all these other young mutants, one of them played by Maisie Williams, who can literally transform into a wolf, another being Anya Taylor-Joy, a shockingly racist Russian girl who can basically turn into a total badass. Like, she can literally create armor on her arm, which does come into play later in the film, and Charlie Heaton sporting an embarrassing Southern accent. Like, He honestly sounds like the type of stereotypical Southern character you would see in a show like South Park or The Simpsons. Just this very typical Southern boy. And this movie does have one or two redeeming things about it. Blue Hunt's character does form a relationship with Maisie Williams' character, and it is actually pretty touching. It's a very well-developed relationship, and a big shock, they actually do end up in a romance. Like, this movie does explore an openly gay teenage relationship, which I have to give it props for, because I honestly can't remember the last time, at least not in a superhero movie, where we saw two gay characters, able to be themselves, able to, display feelings of affection towards one another. I thought that was actually pretty remarkable, and their relationship was honestly the best aspect of this movie. But again, for the first 30 minutes or so, these characters are just getting at each other's throats, and honestly, do you really want to be stuck in an environment with characters who are just yelling at each other all the time, and, even made worse by the fact that these actors aren't delivering necessarily good performances, and many of them are sporting incredibly fake accents. So, let's talk about the horror aspects of this movie. The horror sequences in this movie are incredibly lame. They just don't work. They aren't very well executed. The director, Josh Boone, just clearly didn't know how to make an effective horror sequence. And I'm going to explain, why these horror sequences don't work. And I actually have one scene to use as an example. So we learn that Anya Taylor-Joy's character has been haunted by images of these tall, lanky demons with very sharp teeth. Apparently, these demons attacked her village when she was a young girl, and she has been, traumatized by this event. So there's a sequence where she is in solitary confinement. She's by herself in this locked room, and all of a sudden the door mysteriously opens, and we see on the wall the image of this smiling face. It has been spray painted on the wall, and the buildup isn't that bad, but then it cuts to a shot of her just looking at this face on the wall, and she slowly raises her hand up, which, by the way, she has this quote-unquote companion. It's this little pterodactyl hand puppet. She might as well have Mr. Hand from South Park. It is just totally ridiculous, but, she speaks through this pterodactyl puppet. She says, like, "Oh, this is some scary shit going on here," and it is just so comedic. And the horror sequences are either abruptly cut short, or they end on unintentionally comedic notes. That is a sequence that ended on an unintentionally comedic note. It just didn't work and made us laugh. In another sequence, we learned that this young Brazilian boy accidentally burned his girlfriend alive. He was the cause of her death. So there's a sequence when he is swimming, and he is visited by her apparent corpse, her burnt, charred corpse, and this causes him to, set himself on fire, because when he gets really upset, or when his emotions are running high, he actually lights up. And the sequence ends with him being pushed into the pool, and it's just so comical. And that's why the horror aspects of this movie just don't work, because while occasionally the buildups aren't that bad, the way the sequences end, they just always fall flat. They don't deliver on what they promised, and this director clearly didn't have an understanding of what makes an effective horror sequence. And let's talk a little bit about the climax of this movie. So the climax is basically the New Mutants facing off against this giant CGI bear. I am not kidding. It's this giant bear that has been enveloped in smoke. And I just gotta say this, the smoke monster from James and the Giant Peach was far more terrifying. The rhinoceros from James and the Giant Peach, basically the same concept. In this film, though, it's just this cheap-looking, cartoonish bear, and here's what I thought they were going to do with the conclusion, and you can agree with me on this or not, but I think it would have been a much better conclusion if the New Mutants were facing all of their fears at once. We learned that Blue Hunt's character can manifest people's fears into reality, so whatever you fear, it will take form in reality. That's her power. So wouldn't it have been much more amazing if, they were fighting all of their fears at once, like at the end, instead of just focusing on Danny's fear, that being this giant, cartoonish-looking bear?
This is not over! Yes!
And come on. All of this buildup, and that's the payoff? This giant stupid looking bear that makes Yogi Bear look like a straight up gangster. I mean, come on. The conclusion that I just described, the alternate conclusion, that would have worked so much better. And I guess they do that a little bit because earlier, before that big fight happens, they are visited by those tall, lanky demon monsters with very sharp teeth. And there's a very cool bit where Anya Taylor-Joy slices through them, with her armor. And that was kind of a cool scene, We get a little bit of action there. But it was just such a lame conclusion. And here's another problem with this movie. So the cinematography is very, very flat. This is a very dull, gray-looking movie. And that would have worked if it was much more atmospheric and horrific, but it's not. It is not scary in the slightest. And it feels as if Josh Boone wasn't allowed to, entirely bring his vision to life. And you can just tell because so many of the sequences are just so flat. Like, they have no energy to them. There's no passion. Like, the ending shot is just the New Mutants, walking away from the destroyed hospital. And it's just this flat, static shot of them walking away. And there's no excitement. There's no anticipation of what might come next. It looks like a Marvel TV show. And not one of the better Marvel TV shows like Daredevil or Jessica Jones. I'm talking about a Marvel show like Inhumans. Just a cheap-looking piece of garbage that could have been so much more. But like I said, guys, overall, the New Mutants was just a failed experiment. It could have been, honestly, it should have been so much better. From what I heard, reshoots were scheduled, but I don't think they were able to film any reshoots, so we were left with this 95-minute chore, essentially. That's what this movie is. It's a chore. One or two cool action bits, but overall, this feels like a below-average pilot of a potentially promising TV series. That's what it feels like. But, as you all know, this was the very last film to be released in the X-Men universe, which, by the way, I just have to mention one more thing. It actually does tie directly into films like Logan. There's a sequence where Blue Hunt's character learns what Alice Braga is really up to. She apparently has been working for the Essex Corporation, and they show this grainy handheld footage that was also featured in Logan, like footage of all these young mutants, being experimented on, and but just too little too late. We just don't care. It's like that line in X-Men Dark Phoenix, the one Michael Fassbender has, where he says, there's always a speech, but nobody cares anymore. People stopped caring about the X-Men franchise at this point. We just didn't need anymore. This series should have ended with Logan. I've said that before. It should have ended here. This was a terrific conclusion. The New Mutants is not a terrific conclusion. Right now, we're waiting for Kevin Feige to release the rebooted, or his version of the X-Men, which I heard is in the works, so I'm actually excited about that. But yes, what a disappointment. New Mutants, not totally incompetent, but like I said, it could have been so much more. But guys, those are my overall thoughts on the New Mutants. Thank you so much for joining me in my discussion, and if I could sum up my feelings towards this movie with one image, it would be that image of Hugh Jackman from the first X-Men movie, just flipping off Cyclops, with his with his middle finger, or his his middle claw. That's how I feel about this movie. I just give it a big middle finger. Watch A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 instead. A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, very similar concept, but as I stated, much better villain, much more atmospheric, and the horror sequences in this are actually creative and fun. The New Mutants will not invade your dreams. In fact, it will probably just put you to sleep. Anyway, guys, thank you so much again for joining me in my discussion, all you boys and ghouls. What do we have to look forward to next? We have Godzilla vs. Kong coming out in a couple of weeks. I'm very excited about that. I'm going to get the crew together. We're actually going to go to the movie theater to watch it, and I believe they're going to be showing it in IMAX, so I am really anticipating that. I cannot wait to see Godzilla vs. Kong on the biggest screen imaginable. It's just going to make me feel all giddy inside. I really can't wait for that. Guys, you are the greatest. Thank you again, and if you like this, go ahead and subscribe to our channel Around the Clock Frights for more horrific content. And again, have a very scary day, and whatever you do, don't watch the New Mutants, watch some of the better films in the franchise, like Dark Phoenix, the pinnacle of the X-Men series. I'm kidding. Have a very scary day, guys. Take care.